Coming up on Colonial Crossfire. Dissecting Donald Trump's victory. Where Democrats go from here. And Trump's first 100 days. Joining us on the left, TJ Clark. On the right, Brandon Whitehill. And I'm your moderator, Andrew Desiderio. This is Colonial Crossfire. Washington is painted red. Welcome to Colonial Crossfire. I'm Andrew Desiderio. What we just witnessed was one of the biggest political upsets in modern history. Donald Trump, against all odds, defeated Hillary Clinton in this year's presidential election, and the Republican Party held onto its majorities in the House and the Senate. How did Trump pull off this seemingly impossible feat? How do Democrats recover from this year's shellacking? And what do President-elect Trump's first 100 days look like? Here to analyze that and more, our student panel. On the left, TJ Clark, a senior from Oswego, Illinois, majoring in political science. TJ is the debate committee chair for the GW College Democrats. On the right, Brandon Whitehill, a senior from Philadelphia, majoring in international affairs and economics. Brandon is the co-president of the GW Young Americas Foundation and previously worked for Rand Paul's presidential campaign. Thanks to both of you for joining us. In the run-up to Election Day, what we heard from the pundits was pretty cut and dry. Even if Donald Trump wins every single battleground state, he still loses the presidency due to Clinton's near-certain wins in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, which comprise the Democrats' so-called blue wall. And if Hillary Clinton took Ohio or Florida, it would pretty much be game over for Donald Trump. Not only did Trump sweep the largest battleground states, he tore down that blue wall with his appeal to white working-class voters, coasting to victories in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and likely Michigan once the final vote tally there is calculated. And when you add in the low turnout among the so-called Obama coalition voters, reality started to set in for Clinton and her team on election night. 290 electoral votes later, and we have the first president-elect in our country's history who has no prior political or military experience. Here's what he had to say on election night.
Now it's time for America to bind the wounds of division. Have to get together. To all Republicans and Democrats and independents across this nation, I say it is time for us to come together as one united people. It's time.
TJ, I want to turn to you first. Why did voters in these key states buck the Democratic Party and turn to Donald Trump?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I think the biggest reason why these voters turned to Donald Trump was, frankly, an appeal to what they wanted to hear. Obviously, things haven't been perfect in the last 8 years. There's been a great economic recovery, but it hasn't been all that we want it to be. Donald Trump has spent, his entire campaign from June of 2015 until just last week appealing to white working-class voters, specifically in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt, where I'm from, areas I'm familiar with. So I think that they bucked the Democratic Party just because they wanted to hear something new and something fresh, and frankly, that's what they got from Donald Trump. And I think that he made that appeal through, I think, hateful rhetoric oftentimes, but it was the change that they were looking for.
How much of the blame lays specifically on Hillary Clinton's shoulders for this loss?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not terribly interested in playing the blame game. I think that there's a lot of things that we can learn from this election without pointing fingers or saying that, it was this person's fault or this thing, and calling people out. I don't think that's going to be helpful. I think there's going to have to be a long conversation on the left and specifically in the Democratic Party to talk about how we can learn the lessons from 2016 and apply them to 2020 so we can take back the White House.
Brandon, same question to you. Why did these voters choose Trump over their typical choices of the Democratic Party?
Right, so there's a reason that no poll in the election season showed Trump up in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, because no one expected him to be able to break this firewall. No one was capturing the very real hidden voter that existed for Donald Trump. What he was doing is he was spending his time all over what's called flyover country. He was into the Midwest. He was in North Carolina and Florida, the states he needed to win, which he won, and then again broke the Democratic firewall. And what they really felt was fundamentally misrepresented by the Democratic Party and the Democratic president that we've had for 8 years. Regulations that President Obama has unilaterally signed has crushed small businesses, has crushed energy workers, has crushed manufacturing. how we've ceded to globalization. Not that globalization itself is a bad thing, but without a balance to help those who are hurt by the concentrated harms of that, they're going to turn the other way. And Donald Trump was offering solutions for them, was offering comfort for them, and that he said he was going to go into Washington, drain the swamp, and really represent those interests which have not been represented, which have been fundamentally neglected for the last 8 years.
So in the last few months of the campaign, we had these sort of defining moments of the campaign. Number one was Hillary Clinton's comment about deplorables, which even many Democrats said was not wise of her to say. And then we also had the Comey letter, the initial letter 11 days before the election, and then the Sunday before the election, in which he said, okay, none of these emails relating to Anthony Weiner's computer are related to the Clinton investigation. TJ, do you think any of that affected the outcome of the race? Because Clinton herself has said that the Comey letter did have at least an effect on the outcome.
Sure. I mean, it certainly has an effect, right? You know, we nominated someone that was under FBI investigation. You have the director of the FBI coming out 11 and then 3 days before Election Day talking about the investigation. It was the most toxic, thing about her most toxic characteristic. And so for voters to have been reminded about that, both 11 and 3 days out from the election, of course, will have an impact. I think that her comment about Donald Trump supporters being a basket of deplorables, irredeemable, not wisely worded. Though I will add, though, that it had been things that she was saying earlier. It was just in that one instance that it was misworded, where she said half of Donald Trump supporters are irredeemable, which is not what she had been saying beforehand. She gave a speech in Carson City, if I remember correctly, or Reno, where she talked about the alt-right and how that made up such a huge portion of Donald Trump's support. And frankly, a lot of the alt-right are deplorable. You have these unashamed and unabashed racists that talk about white supremacy, espousing anti-Semitic views. It is no question that a lot of the alt-right, or a part of the alt-right at the very least, is irredeemable and is deplorable. I think the deplorable comment just in that one instance was misworded.
Do you agree with TJ that the alt-right is deplorable?
Not categorically deplorable. There are certainly some elements, especially on Twitter, when they're out in force, when they're sort of unrestrained, there's no accountability, that is reprehensible, and I'm willing to condemn that when it rears its ugly head.
What about Steve Bannon?
Steve Bannon has now a White House job, and Steve Bannon is someone who does not have a very public persona. There are some snippets that we've heard about him. You have to trust that Donald Trump is surrounding himself with good people, and that if Steve Bannon is espousing anti-Semitism and just bigoted views in the White House, that he would be dismissed. But the Trump administration has not yet been inaugurated. We don't know exactly what advice Steve Bannon is giving Donald Trump. It could be constructive, and we should be open-minded to that.
No, I'm sorry. I think Steve Bannon's not a private figure. He was the editor-in-chief of Breitbart for years since Andrew Breitbart died.
So could you list his views about several different topics?
Sure, I can tell you.
I
can tell you that as editor-in-chief, he cleared articles that espouse anti-Semitic and racist views. The editor-in-chief doesn't just let things go on without knowing about them, and that these things were happening under his watch is important. We hold leaders accountable based on what happens under their watch, and that's what was happening under his watch at Breitbart. To say nothing of the fact that his wife, when he was charged with domestic abuse or domestic violence, went on the record to say that he espoused anti-Semitic views and talked about how he didn't want his children going to schools with too many Jews. So look, yeah, I mean, I'm on part of my party that is willing to give Donald Trump a chance. I am hoping for the best, but frankly, I'm going to stand up and call out things that are wrong, and it is wrong to put an anti-Semite and a racist footsteps away from the Oval Office, and specifically one that's going to have an equal part with his chief of staff. We know who Steve Bannon is, and it shouldn't be a surprise when people say, this guy that's espoused anti-Semitic and racist views, he's an anti-Semite, he's a racist, he's a white nationalist.
And yeah, you are right that he has a public persona in his position as editor-in-chief at Breitbart, that's what he was responsible for. However, this is someone who is CEO of Trump's campaign, and we never saw him out speaking. We never really understood the contribution that he made to Trump's campaign, a campaign that was now quite successful because of his resonance with voters throughout the country. So what I'm asking you to do is, for a second, wait until the Trump administration is inaugurated, see what advice is coming out of Bannon and Priebus, see how Trump handles and balances those opinions, and if there is anti-Semitism, if there is something unacceptable, I will stand shoulder to shoulder with you and hope that he is dismissed.
I can't understand why, just because Steve Bannon hasn't had a public role for the last 6 or so months, that we wouldn't take his record as it is.
Because we would have no idea if he has
he's just not an anti-Semite
if he has been making constructive contributions to this campaign and to this movement that so many Americans endorse and dismiss your party over.
No, I mean, I just think that when someone's an anti-Semite, when someone's a white nationalist, when someone's a racist, when they led a publication that espoused those views, And just because they've been quiet for 6 months doesn't make them not any of that anymore. They are still that. And
so aside from these potential cabinet appointments or appointments in the West Wing, TJ, doesn't the GOP have a mandate to govern? Doesn't Donald Trump have a mandate to choose who he wants, given how stunning or how large the margin was of his victory and of the GOP's victory?
Margin of his victory. He didn't win the popular vote.
He took most of the Electoral College.
That's true. No, yeah. And absolutely. And look, I am on the record. I have said that when we got involved in this election, we knew the only votes that mattered were the 270th Electoral College. The Democratic Party didn't get there. But I do think that it is important to consider the popular vote amongst the American people. That those that voted, most Americans decided they wanted Hillary Clinton to be president.
But you're not arguing that we should get
no, I'm not saying that. Okay. All I'm saying is that it is important to note that most Americans, when they went to the ballot box, decided I want Hillary Clinton to be president. And even if that weren't true, about 53% of Americans didn't want Donald Trump to be president. And all of that's important. That said, I do think it is the right of the president to appoint who he wants to cabinet positions, to the Supreme Court, and even to his own White House staff. But I think it is equally important for the American people, and in this case, liberals and Democrats in particular, to stand up and call somebody a spade when they're a spade. Look, you have white nationalists that are saying he's one of us. You have the leader of the American neo-Nazi party that said, wow, I'm surprised that Donald Trump actually appointed one of our own.
And we were making these same observations about the sketchy associations that President Obama had throughout the campaign and during his transition period.
But we gave them a wait-and-see chance. Come on. Seriously. Look,
we did.
No, we didn't.
There was a loud voice from the right that criticized a lot of President Obama's appointments, but they were once he was president and once we saw what they were doing.
Look, I'm old enough to remember the Van Jones appointment and how that was immediately called off without giving Van Jones a chance.
Once he was inaugurated.
Here's
Same thing with Anita Dunn.
Here's a story. So the fact is that even if that is true, Anita Dunn and Van Jones were not espousing racist, anti-Semitic and exclusive language.
Well, we can go back and look at the things that Van Jones said about the United States of America, and we can go look at the tapes of Anita Dunn citing Mao Zedong as her favorite political philosopher and saying that political change comes from the barrel of a gun. Again, we're not talking about the same scale because they're different types of transgressions, racism or whatever, or just being a radical, but there are sketchy associations on both sides, and the magnifying glass is up to an administration when they're naming all these people, when they're transitioning to the White House. And what I'm saying is that we have the right to call people out. We have the right to hold our president to account and say, you need to have yourself surrounded by good people, but we should see the contribution that they're making. We should see that the job and the role that they're doing in the White House before we categorically say this is unacceptable, this is reprehensible.
The blatant difference between a radical and a racist is being inspired by hate. I disagree because if you're a radical, Steve Bannon is a white nationalist. He led a white nationalist publication that espoused anti-Semitic and racist views. And I hate that we have to stick on this because this should be so easy. This should be so easy that somebody that espouses these views, someone that leads a publication that espouses these views, this should be so easy. This should be, a categorical no. Like this guy should not be working in the White House.
It should be easy once we see in a couple months he's inaugurated what he does.
I have no faith. I have no faith that the Republican Party, who spent an entire primary process not doing enough to stand up to Donald Trump, spent an entire general election cycle not doing enough to stand up to Donald Trump, that now all of a sudden they're going to stand up to Donald Trump now that he's president of the United States. I just don't have that faith.
I got to go to break, but real quick, President Obama still has a pretty high approval rating. Do you view this election as a rejection of President Obama and his signature policy initiatives?
No, I don't think so. I think that the Democratic Party and President Obama specifically have a right to be disappointed that his coalition didn't come out and vote. We know that. I think that if the coalition had come out to vote, that Hillary Clinton would be president-elect today.
Brandon,
I think an important figure to note is that consistently throughout the last several years, some 70% of Americans believe we are on the wrong track. They voted up and down the ballot for Republican candidates who promised to repeal Obamacare, roll back his executive orders, and cut regulations. I think you're going to see very quickly that legacy that Obama has built evaporate, and that's what voters have asked for.
All right, we will come right back. Coming up after the break, we'll turn our focus to Donald Trump's first 100 days and how Democrats can get back on their feet. Stay with us.
Raise high. This isn't just our battle cry. It's our call, our challenge. Because when you are called to Washington, you are called to higher expectations, to a higher standard. We are called here to advance knowledge, to serve society, to change the world. This is the George Washington University, and what we make is history. So stand up, be bold, take risks, press on, push harder, raise high.
Welcome back. Donald Trump certainly has a lot of work to do, but before he can hit the ground running on his policy goals, Democrats and Republicans are calling on him to take major steps to unify the country after what was a bitter campaign. In the meantime, though, Trump is beginning to assemble his top White House advisors and cabinet members. Among the names Trump is rumored to be considering for top posts, Rudy Giuliani, John Bolton, General Mike Flynn, Nikki Haley, Jamie Dimon, Bob Corker, Chris Kobach, Jeff Sessions, and more. While Trump focuses on staffing his administration, Democrats are asking one question: how? How did Hillary Clinton lose so badly to Donald Trump? Bernie Sanders, for one, says the Democratic Party has focused too much on benefiting the, quote, liberal elite while ignoring the needs of the middle class.
How does it happen that they win elections and Democrats lose? And I think what the conclusion is that Democrats have focused too much with a liberal elite, which is raising incredible sums of money from wealthy people in the upper middle class, but has ignored to a very significant degree the working class and the middle class and low-income people in this country.
The next hurdle for Democrats will be to pick a new chair of the Democratic National Committee. Sanders has backed Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison for the soon-to-be vacant post. TJ, do you agree with Bernie Sanders' diagnosis, and is Keith Ellison the right person to lead your party forward?
Yeah, I think it's hard to disagree with Bernie Sanders, right? I think that his diagnosis is spot on. That I think the Democratic Party, to some degree, has ignored specifically white working class folks back in the Midwest. Again, where I'm from, these are people that I know, that I grew up with, that were my neighbors. But I do want to add, and I think it's really important, is that there has been, especially in the last week since Election Day, a fair amount of criticism laid at a liberal elite, specifically a coastal liberal elite. When I think it's important to note that a lot of the Democratic Party's constituency is the urban poor, and I don't think they feel very elite, and that's still a part of the country that we're really looking out for, that we have policies for. So I totally agree with Bernie Sanders that I think that we can do more. We can always be reaching out to more voters, and I think that we recognize this loss here, but I think it's important to recognize that we still have a solid base where we have it, and we can still serve them as well.
Brandon, same question.
So about the urban poor, I can't remember a time when Democrats were not in control of the country's urban centers, and yet poverty has not alleviated since the 1960s. So I think perhaps there's a little bit of a rejection on their part there. But in terms of the DNC more broadly, the need for reform and soul searching, I'll leave that mostly to you. But I will say that from my perspective, watching this as a participant in the election process, the biggest problem with the DNC is that it's not listening to people. It does whatever it wants. And you saw all this complaining about Hillary winning the popular vote. You also saw Hillary won the popular vote in the primary back in 2007 and 2008, got more votes than did President Obama. You see a system that is being criticized using superdelegates. You see a system now through the WikiLeaks emails that we know was completely rigged for Hillary in the first place. And so you're seeing people lash out against a party that is just not built for people to participate in. It's built for people to just manipulate from the top down. And so my one bit of suggestion for you and some free advice for the DNC would be to go to Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, those states that you weren't supposed to lose, and ask how you lost those people. Ask them what they can do, what you can do under a Trump administration to earn their vote in 2018 and 2020. But I don't see the DNC doing that because it is fundamentally a top-down system.
Sure. I mean, I think, look, there's no question the DNC operated counter to the belief of a lot of Democrats this cycle. I totally contest this notion that the election was rigged. Hillary Clinton still had more votes than Bernie Sanders did in this cycle, and she won more delegates too. Look, I think there's a lot of reform that can be made in the superdelegate system. I don't disagree with you. I think that we could probably lower those, but I do think it's important, and I think, and I really believe this, that there ought to still be a superdelegate system. I think that your party really struggled with the notion of Donald Trump, and I think that you really could have used some people that work in politics and work in public service to prevent the nomination of Donald Trump. And I think that that's a really important thing for us to have superdelegates, an important reason that we can protect our party from being subjected to a populist that builds his message on hateful rhetoric. As for the next chair of the party, I don't disagree. I think that there's a lot of votes that can be won in the Midwest. Again, I'm from here. I know these people. I know these communities. and I know what they're struggling with. And I think that Keith Ellison, I think, would be terrific. I think that there's certainly a lot of symbolism there that I'm certainly in favor of, and I think that he's been a valued member of the Progressive Caucus in Congress. We also have another great candidate in Howard Dean and a record of success there, and he rebuilt the party from a similar situation starting back in after 2004.
So Brandon mentioned 2018, but going forward, the map doesn't look too good for Democrats in 2018. You have a lot of Democratic senators up for re-election in red states that rode the Obama wave in 2012 and probably wouldn't be there in the Senate now if President Obama hadn't been on the ballot in 2012. With the map not looking so good in 2018 in terms of taking back the Senate, do you guys now have to just focus on the next presidential election and ensuring that Donald Trump is just a one-term president?
No, I don't think so. I think that, look, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, she won re-election in 2012. So it wasn't as if she was an unknown entity.
But there are others, John Tester.
You're right. You're absolutely John Tester, Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp in Montana, Indiana, and North Dakota, respectively. Yeah. So certainly, yeah. But I don't think that it's a good idea to just give this up. Look, that has been the DNC's policy under Debbie Wasserman Schultz, is this policy of entrenchment, and that does not work. When we accept that we can only win in certain areas and we decide not to compete, we don't grow our message. We don't get our message out to these voters. If we just decide we can never win in North Dakota and we never compete, there will never be a Democratic Party in North Dakota. We will never compete. If we don't start investing our resources now and start building our message there now, when are we going to do it? When are we ever going to start competing in North Dakota and in Indiana and in Montana and all across this country? So I think it's important to compete in 2018 so that we can build off that message by 2020.
Brandon, I want to pivot to Trump's transition efforts. Last week he gave an interview to 60 Minutes on CBS in which he said he would keep portions of Obamacare. He said he's okay with the gay marriage ruling at the Supreme Court. Is he betraying the voters who supported him, particularly evangelical voters and other voters around the country who see their premiums rising because of Obamacare and aren't really in tune with the fact that Donald Trump wants to keep two major portions of it?
Okay, well, a few points there. For one, I think you've seen since the election that he's taken a much more pragmatist, much more moderate view as to how to approach his transition. He's trying to be a president for all. He has not been using divisive rhetoric since Election Day, which I think is a good thing, and I'm cautiously optimistic about how he'll go forward with that. About the two policy points that you bring up, with Obamacare, he's keeping the portions that are very popular, actually, being able to stay on health care until you're 26, for one, and that's not what's driving up premium costs and driving down quality. What we're looking to repeal is the whole premise that government and a central government through the Health and Human Services Department can run the entire nation's health care. What we're repealing is an individual mandate that penalizes people who don't want a certain type of health care and penalizes small businesses who have to lay off people or cut hours because they can't afford to provide health care for their workers. So what we're doing are things that will structurally help the economy, make health care more patient and doctor-centered rather than regulator and healthcare provider-centered, and so you see a good fidelity to that promise, and Republicans in Congress are going to hold up their bargain there. And with the gay marriage ruling, there's just really no theoretical path back to the Supreme Court to be able to undo that. That's something that's pretty much set. And for what evangelicals mainly vote, which is Roe v. Wade since the 1970s, that we've been kind of motivated to vote on that case in particular, there is a strong commitment to appointing a pro-life justice who would hopefully undo that.
TJ, Brandon mentioned the point of Trump sort of moderating on some of his key proposals. Do you think this means then he won't try to ban Muslims, build a wall, some of these other initiatives he's proposed?
Well, we just don't know, right? I think that's for me at least the scariest part of a Donald Trump presidency is the whole thing is very unpredictable. And right now it's just questions about appointments to his staff and into his cabinet, to the Supreme Court. But these are eventually going to be questions of war and peace, and he's just incredibly unpredictable. I will note though, and I think it's important to do so, that Donald Trump, to this point, has used divisive rhetoric already, calling out the New York Times, saying that they were failing, saying that protesters in the streets were, not respecting the results of the election and being disrespectful. Like that's instead of inviting them in and trying to talk to them and hearing their concerns.
He invited them in the minutes that he won the election on election night, and yet they still took to the street and hold up signs that say rape Melania and all things like that.
Okay, there's one sign.
There's one, yeah.
That's one sign, and I'm not going to stand by it, but what I'm going to tell you is that he said that night, and then when the protest carried out, because there are fair concerns about a Donald Trump presidency and what that will mean for a lot of Americans not like you and I, and not like Andrew, but a lot of fair concerns about people worried about how their lives are going to change. And so instead of hearing out those concerns, he immediately took to Twitter, as he always does, and called them out. And then it wasn't until about 8 hours later that he went back and said, oh, this is actually great, I love that we're seeing this. But his reaction in that moment was to call them out and say that they were wrong instead of hearing their concerns. Look, there are very fair concerns. He's talked about a Muslim ban. He's talked about deporting 11 million people out of this country, a lot of whom have lived here for over 10 years.
He's talked about deporting criminals.
So
that's
not true. I mean, he has talked about deporting 11 million people and banning Muslims from this country. And he's also talked about, look, he has talked about banning Muslims from this country. He has talked about deporting 11 million people, most of whom have lived here for over 10 years. So there are fair concerns from people that are not like you and I.
And
I think that it's worth.
Things that he said as President-elect.
I'm not. I'm just not. I'm
that
telling.
He would deport criminals, not 11 million people. But
again, his campaign didn't say that.
This is not about campaigning anymore.
So he was lying in the campaign. Was he?
What I'm
was
saying
he
is
lying?
that it is time.
Was he lying?
No. What I'm saying is that it is time to govern.
Look,
he did not expect to win this election, and yet he did. Wait a second. It is time to govern. We have Republicans with victories up and down the ballot and holding both houses of Congress and the presidency. He is not going to be able to ban all Muslims. That is would not even pass Congress, and is questionably constitutional. So what I'm saying is that you see this moderation because it is time to govern.
Brandon, if I tell you today that I'm going to give you $5 tomorrow, and tomorrow I give you $2.50, was I lying?
Not the same thing at all.
Oh, got it.
You can extrapolate to fallacies, but what I'm talking about are the policies that our government will pursue. And what you're going to see Congress do, the priorities that Congress has laid out.
Brandon, he promised that he would deport 11 million people from this country.
If you're interested in talking about things that aren't going to happen,
he promised that he would appoint. He promised he would appoint a justice that would. He said that abortion, that when a woman has an abortion, which is her right, that they should be punished. Look, I agree that there's a difference between campaigning and governing, but my point is that when his campaign was based on such hateful rhetoric, that there are fair concerns from the American public. Again, I think it is, I'm going to say this again, I think it is difficult for people like you and I to understand it because, frankly, we're not going to be really impacted by a lot of these policies.
I think all of us are going to be impacted by what the next president does. And I'm saying we're trying to have a conversation about President-elect Trump and his agenda. He's laid out some policy points.
You're not hearing the
and
concerns.
You're not interested in talking about them.
I would love to talk about them, but I think it's important to hear out these concerns.
Let's talk about infrastructure spending. Let's talk about those.
Look, and I think that's great. And the Democrats in Congress have talked about how we want to work with them on infrastructure spending because we should absolutely be working for the American people. But a lot of the American people are concerned. Again, more people voted for Hillary Clinton. A lot of people are concerned about what this is going to mean for our country. So look, I agree there's a difference between campaigning and governing. And I agree that for the most part, Donald Trump has moderated and taken a more pragmatic approach as president-elect. But to ignore the fact that he based his campaign on hateful rhetoric and to not hear the concerns of a lot of Americans about what their lives are going to look like if they're even going to be allowed to stay or get in here ever again.
That is going to have to be the last word. Thank you, guys. After this break, it's rapid fire. Stay with us.
Great journalism matters because it's critical to a democracy that the public is informed and engaged and involved. And that happens by having credible information. And so the most important thing, whatever the delivery platform, whatever the technology, whatever the business model, is that the information itself is coming in solid and important ways and is being conveyed in compelling ways because there's so much noise and competition out there. And so that's what I really want our students to be able to do, be brilliant storytellers, keen observers, and compelling communicators.
Welcome back. Our panel joins us again for Rapid Fire, some quick answers to some quick questions. Next month, voters in Italy will head to the polls to decide whether to accept Prime Minister Matteo Renzi's sweeping constitutional reforms that will streamline the legislative process. Analysts predict the vote will have a significant impact on European financial markets. Renzi has staked his political future on the referendum, and he might fall victim to the populist anger that propelled Donald Trump and Brexit. Brandon, should the Italians accept the constitutional reforms, and do you worry that the vote could lead to an Italian exit from either the Eurozone currency or the EU?
I don't want to comment too much on the internal politics of Italy. I know our president likes to interfere with things like Brexit and whatnot, but I think just as a commentator's point, I don't think it's going to pass. I think just at this point, heading into the end of the year, we've seen this year with Brexit, with President Trump, It's probably not going to pass because of this populist wave. And for better or for worse, Italy is going to go through some changes. I don't necessarily foresee an Italian exit, though, at least not yet.
TJ.
Yeah, I mean, look, I am of the part of my party that believes in free trade and in globalization. So anything that could aid in that cause, so long as it's good for every country's people and their working class, and I'm all for it. Based on what I understand, is that it doesn't look like it's going to pass. I think that's too bad. I think that Prime Minister Renzi was a rising star on the world stage. Hoping that it does pass, that he's able to stay in office. But anything that would predate a leave from the European Union would concern me.
And Donald Trump pledged throughout his campaign that he would withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement. But Secretary of State John Kerry has said that the Obama administration would try to implement as much of the agreement as possible before Trump takes office. Brandon, should Trump withdraw the U.S. from the agreement, and will he?
We see this rush to implement as much as possible is exactly the sort of thing that voters rejected. A central government pushing through without considering how it might impact Americans. And you see Trump's fundamental promise is to put Americans first. Not that we're going to withdraw from the world stage, not that we're going to do anti-trade measures, but that we're going to consider the American first. So I think in diagnosing that, we probably will pull out of the agreement, and I probably think that's a good idea because it should be renegotiated with the American in mind. That's clearly what the people voted for.
TJ.
Yeah, people also voted for Barack Obama twice in astounding numbers, and I think that it's important for us as the United States of America, the superpower of the world, to take a leading role in the fight against climate change. This is probably the defining issue of our time. We only have one plan B. We only have one planet. There is no planet B. This is it. So any agreement that I think can aid in that, and the Paris Climate Agreement has gotten rave reviews for helping us roll back the effects of climate change. If we need to implement it to save our planet, I'm all for it.
And another big issue, Facebook has faced recent criticism for its role in amplifying fake news stories. Some have said this even contributed to Donald Trump's victory. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg has pushed back on these claims. TJ, does Facebook have a responsibility similar to a media company in its curation of trending topics and viral content?
I mean, Facebook asserts that they're not a media company and that they're a social media company, that things that get shared ought to be, be able to be trending. I do think it's important to recognize the fact that a lot of people get their news from Facebook. Whether or not that actually impacted the vote for Donald Trump and if that led to his victory, I don't know, and I'm not really willing to comment on. I think there's other ways that a party can win or lose, but I do think it's important that Facebook and Twitter as well, other social media sites, start to recognize that a lot of people, most people I think, actually get their news from these sites now, and they ought to be promoting those that can be factually accurate.
Brandon.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's very unfortunate that some people just make up patently false headlines, and people usually only read the headlines.
Yep.
And not everyone, but a lot of people just see the headlines, share it, just internalize it. So there should be some way for users in a social media setting to report something that is false, or to crowdsource, say this is not right, and for a way for that to be, brought down. But it is unfortunate, and I would be willing to comment that I do not think it made a decisive impact on the election. I just don't see that.
And with that, a point of agreement, we will end our debate here on Colonial Crossfire. Thank you very much, TJ Clark and Brandon Whitehill, for joining us.
Thank you.
When we come back, Casey Decker sits down with one of the few pundits who correctly predicted a Trump presidency thanks to his unique way of looking at politics. Don't miss it.
History isn't only what's happened. History is also what's happening. At the George Washington University, we're making history every day.
We pass legislation that shapes our lives, our culture, and our future.
We live the mantra, champions in the classroom, in the community, and in competition.
Which instills in us a determination to reach new heights.
We break new ground in the treatment of patients and the study of disease.
And tackle the most important challenges in our society.
We form new relationships and grow as entrepreneurs.
And we imagine new ways to connect on a global scale.
As alumni, we make history by supporting students.
We create scholarships that make an exceptional education attainable.
We provide tools and facilities that allow new ideas to come alive.
And we enhance GW's academics by attracting world-renowned faculty.
And delivering career-launching opportunities.
I'm making history.
I'm making history.
I'm making history.
The George Washington University is making a difference. The George Washington University is making history. Join us.
Welcome back to Colonial Crossfire. I'm Casey Decker. For more than a week now, we've been talking about how everybody got this election wrong. The pollsters, the pundits, the media, even the campaigns themselves, nobody saw this coming. But that's not entirely true. A very select few did see this coming. Alan Lichtman is a professor of history right up the street at American University, and history is exactly what he used to predict that Donald Trump would win the presidency. His unique model has correctly predicted every election outcome since 1984. That's a sterling record for more than 30 years. And he's now predicting Donald Trump will be impeached. Alan Lichtman joins us now. Professor Lichtman, we'll get to your new prediction in a moment, but first, can you run us through your election predicting process? How does that work?
Yes, as you indicate, my prediction system is unique. It's based on historical analysis and interpretation. I developed my system in 1981 in collaboration with the world-renowned mathematician Volodya Kailas-Borak. We looked at every American election from 1860, the horse and buggy days of politics, to 1980, the days of computers and jet planes and television. And we were guided by the thesis that presidential elections are primarily judgments on the strength and performance of the party holding the White House, and the challenging party had little influence on the outcomes. This study led us to find 13 key factors, the 13 keys that are simple true-false questions, where an answer of true always favors the re-election of the White House party. And if 6 or more of the answers are false, the White House party is a predicted loser. And that's what I found this time, that there were enough negative keys against the incumbent Democratic Party to predict their defeat. I won't go through all of them, but some of the factors that contributed to this prediction were the Democrats took big losses in the midterm elections of 2014. Their sitting president could not run again. Open seats are tough. They had a contentious party battle. The keys go turn by turn. And in the second term, the Obama administration did not achieve a major domestic policy accomplishment. And in the second term, they did not have a big splashy success like the dispatch of Osama bin Laden in the first term. Those are some of the key indicators that I look at that nobody else does.
How is it, though, that you think that this election, where so many insane things happened, things that had never happened before, these 13 keys still held true?
Well, this is a great question. You know, I'm not a hedger, and for the first time I did issue a qualification. I said, while the patterns of history point to a Democratic defeat, in Donald Trump, you have a dangerously precedent-breaking candidate who at so many levels is outside the patterns of history. 12 allegations of sexual assault. You know, in 2012, Herman Cain for a while was the favorite for the Republican nomination. 3 or 4 women accused him of sexual harassment, and that drove him out of the race. But despite Donald Trump, the patterns of history prevailed. They are that strong. So Donald Trump wins this election, not because of Donald Trump, not because of his campaign, but despite it.
Were there any keys in particular that you thought held particular prominence in this election?
Well, the beauty of my system is each key weighs equally. Unlike other prediction systems that have multipliers, they multiply their predictors. However, the problem with all of those models is the predictors, the multipliers, change unpredictably every 4 years. Same problem with the polls in trying to adjust for likely voters. But the two things that I would highlight, because they had, they in part had to do with Republican obstructionism, was the lack of a major domestic policy accomplishment because the Republicans blocked anything once they gained control of Congress that Obama wanted to do, and the lack of a big foreign policy success. You know, if the invasion of Mosul had started a couple of months earlier, it might have been completed before the election, and you might have had a different result. Plus, you had this contentious primary. I wrote very early on when the contest started that Barack Obama has got to stop being so passive, and he's got to decisively intervene, endorse Hillary Clinton, and stop this divisive challenge. He didn't do it.
So even though that this election was pretty much all about Donald Trump and to some extent about Hillary Clinton, you still think that overall the voters were more impacted by what happened in the Obama administration in the last 4 years?
The basic foundation of my prediction system that differs from so much else. I say, forget the polls, forget the pundits, don't look at the day-to-day events of the campaign. In fact, elections are decided primarily during the 4 years of the term, not during the campaign, and voters are deciding whether or not governance has been good enough to give the incumbent party 4 more years, or should this be a change kind of election. I first made my prediction in late September. I then doubled down on my prediction in a Washington Post interview on October 28th. At the low point of the Trump campaign, that was after the sex tape came out, that was after a dozen women accused him of sexual assault, and before the Comey letter. I think that gives a lot of credibility to what I was doing.
You mentioned some of the flaws you see in polls. What's your general opinion of polls?
I have nothing against the pollsters. I think they do a fine job. But polls are not predictors. They are misused and abused as predictors. Polls are snapshots at any given moment in time. And by the way, there's no way of knowing whether the polls are right or wrong because there's no reality against which to check them since no votes have been cast as yet. And you don't know how voting intentions might shift at another point in time. In addition, all of these polls screen for likely voters, but they don't know who is going to vote. So when the pollsters tell you the margin of error is plus and minus 3.5%, that is only sampling error. That presumes everything else, including the likely voter screen, is 100% correct, and we know it's not. And so the error is actually much larger. The other problem with polls is they lead to lazy and misleading journalism. You don't have to get out of bed in the morning to write a story about the polls and to cover elections as though they were horse races with candidates sprinting ahead and falling behind every day and the pollsters keeping score. And that misses the deeper forces that drive elections. It misses the implications of elections, and it leads to traditional, negative, soundbite, ad-driven kind of campaigning. If you were to campaign by the keys, you would get rid of all the negative ads, waste the money, they never turned an election, and instead build a foundation for governing, which would in turn, if you win, help you get reelected 4 years later.
Do you think then that media coverage, since it is during the election largely focused on the horse race, do you think that it should be more reflective of the previous 4 years of the current administration than of the candidates who are running?
Absolutely. And to the extent it looks at the candidates who are running, it should look at what their election means for the future of the country. You know, the pundits have spilled millions upon millions of words in covering this election. And I guarantee you, nobody remembers a thing they said. Moreover, the pundits had to twist themselves into pretzels to explain this election. The day before the election, they were saying, oh, that divisive Trump campaign, Trump can't win. 24 hours later, they had to explain why what they said could not happen did happen. Well, it's the same Trump campaign, and all of these after-the-fact rationalizations are absolutely meaningless. And by the way, the compilers of polls, the Nate Silvers of this world, they're no better. Nate Silver's a clerk. He doesn't do independent scientific analysis. He just compiles polls. And when he says, you know, it's a 71.5% probability of a Clinton win, that's what I call the fallacy of false precision. That's not a real probability. That's just based on the underlying polls. And if the polls are off, the probability is off and could be off by huge margins.
So you're making this new prediction now that President Trump will be impeached. What's that based on?
Well, it's not based on a scientific system, like my prediction of an election result. It's just speculation coming out of my gut, but I have good reasons for it. First of all, one of the Lichtman rules of politics is what you see is what you get. Candidates don't fundamentally change. Like when you get married, oh, I'm going to change my spouse. Wrong, it never works. And Trump has played fast and loose with the law all his life, and that could translate into the presidency. Just to cite a few examples, we know that he ran an illegal, unregistered charity in the state of New York. We know the IRS fined him because he made an illegal campaign contribution from that charity. There is very strong, unrefuted documentation uncovered by David Farrenhall of the Washington Post that Trump broke the Cuban embargo at a time when that was a serious federal crime. He faces a civil racketeering suit for Trump University. A dozen women have accused him of sexual assault. And by the way, it was a sexual harassment lawsuit by Paula Jones that opened the door to the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Secondly, why would a Republican Congress impeach him? Well, of course, it would depend on what he did. And by the way, he's setting up a huge train wreck by turning his business over to his children, keeping it all in the family, and then trying to get them top secret security clearances. There could be a huge clash between his private economic interests and national security. So why would the Republicans be interested in impeaching him? Because they much prefer Mike Pence. Trump's a loose cannon. You don't know what he might do. Mike Pence is a down-the-line, predictable, conservative Christian Republican.
Well, that's all we have for you today. Professor Lichtman, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
When we come back, Samantha Cookenham has our debate fact check.
Welcome back. During our panel discussion, a team of fact-checkers monitored our debate. Samantha Cookenham is here to fill us in on what we missed. Samantha?
Thanks, Andrew. Just one minor factual error today. Our Republican debater Brandon said around 70% of Americans believe the country is on the wrong track. That's mostly true. However, according to a recent Rasmussen poll, that number still sits around 60%. That's all we have for the fact check. Andrew?
All right, thanks, Samantha. And now for Spilled Milk. Here's our tribute to the very best of late-night political comedy.
Today, my love has gone away. The bottle stands so long, the symbol of the dawn.
Why is anyone surprised that it's taking Trump this long to hire his administration? After all, I mean, this is the same guy who needed 13 weeks to fill one job. Maybe he's putting them through challenges. Maybe that's what he's doing. It seems like you'd be a great attorney general, but first, I need you and Brandy Glanville to write a jingle for Bud Light Limeritas.
We now have to give him a chance and see how he's going to govern.
The American people should give him a chance to govern, because if he succeeds, we succeed.
Now, in the broadest sense, I get that impulse. Hope for the best in the face of very long odds. It's like we're on a plane and we just found out our pilot is a wombat. I don't like this, I don't understand how it happened, and I'm pretty sure we're headed for disaster, but what the hell? Come on, Batty, prove me wrong!
So he changed his mind on protesting from 2012 to 2016, and we should expect him to continue to change his mind. By 2018, don't be surprised to see President Trump tweet, "Very unfair to blame President for America's problems. This job is hard and I am sad."
The whites are furious. We've never seen anything like it. I haven't seen white people this mad since the O.J. verdict.
And now the Secret Service says they're going to close parts of Fifth Avenue. Traffic's going to be so backed up, people in their cars will start drinking their own urine to survive. Whole generations of New Yorkers will be born and die without ever leaving their Uber.
All right, well, that's all for this episode of Colonial Crossfire. For all the latest updates from our political team at any time, be sure to follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. And check us out online at www.gw-tv.com. For all of us here at GWTV, I'm Andrew Desiderio. Thanks for getting caught in the crossfire with us. We'll see you right back here next time.